Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for tuning in today. According to Rabbi Hanoch Hecht, the way Jews prepare and serve their food has a higher and deeper meaning than just physical sustenance. Fittingly, the idea for his new book, A Kabbalah of Food, Stories, Teachings, Recipes, came over latkes and bagels one Sunday morning while studying Kabbalah, the mystical part of Judaism. One of Hecht's students suggested he, as a chef and a religious leader, write a book exploring exactly what they were doing, eating, and spending time in an atmosphere of spirituality. Well, the idea didn't come out of nowhere. In 2016, Rabbi Hecht became the first rabbi ever to compete on the Food Network's Chopped, appearing with a priest, a nun-in-training, and a pastor. He's made latkes on Good Day New York and has taught kosher cooking at the Culinary Institute of America. Now the leader of the Rhinebeck Jewish Center and director of Chabad of Dutchess County, New York, Rabbi Hecht still finds time to flex his culinary skills, including for his 7 children. We're lucky to have him with us today. Otherwise known as the 6-Minute Rabbi from his 6-Minute Rabbi Torah classes, Rabbi Hecht and I will talk about his book, A Kabbalah of Food, how food and rituals are inexorably linked in Jewish culture and religion, and the unique experiences and challenges of being both a religious figure and a professional cook. Rabbi Hecht, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I am a big fan of yours, and of course, everybody knows the work that B'nai B'rith does throughout the entire world. So we're very, very grateful for your work, and I'm very, very grateful to be here this morning with you as well.
Well, thank you. Well, before we delve into your book, let's briefly talk about Kabbalah, one of the foundations of your book. Tell us about it and the significance of it and why you chose to incorporate it into the book. You could have done a recipe book. You could have talked about, here's Jewish food and how to prepare it. But you chose to bring in Kabbalah and Jewish teaching. So tell us about that.
So Kabbalah in general, for those that are not familiar with it, is basically the mystical teachings of Judaism. Judaism has many different facets, and one of those facets are the mystical teachings. And it has to be specifically today's state of mind that we have to engage Judaism on every level. We have to engage Judaism on a mystical level as well, as a greater dimension in spirituality. The challenge that I find is that we have this belief that in order to be spiritual, in order to be godly, one has to remove themselves from the physical world, go out on hike a mountain, sit on the top of a cliff, and meditate, and that's how one attains spirituality. But I think if one studies the Kabbalah, they would understand that the exact opposite is true. Of course, there are times for meditation. Of course, there are times to hike a mountain and be mesmerized with God's creation within nature. But the real way to attain the highest levels of spirituality is through the physical. And in Judaism as a whole, one looks at from the basic Bible, from the basic Torah, throughout all the writings and teachings of our rabbis, we find that food plays a fundamental role in our daily activities, but even more so in attaining spirituality. If you want to talk about the temple and the sacrifices, or if you want to go back even earlier, the second of our forefathers, Yitzchak Avinu, Isaac, feels that he's on his deathbed and he wants to bless his son. And what would you think one does in order to prepare to yourself to bless your child before you leave this world? You would think you focus on maybe open up a book of the holy writings and study a little bit, and then you come and approach to bless your child. And yet he turns to his son Esau, he turns to Esau and says, listen, go make me some food that I love eating, and then my soul can bless you. That there has to be a certain satisfaction in the physical world in order that his soul is able to bless his son. So we find on one hand, one has to study Kabbalah, but on the other hand, in order to attain the highest levels of spirituality, I believe that's through embracing the physical, through embracing pleasure within this world. And one of those pleasures, and one of the parts of that is food in particular.
An instrumental figure in the concept of Kabbalah and studying Kabbalah was the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov. How did he change Jewish thought and tradition?
So I think in order to begin with the Baal Shem Tov, maybe is not the right point to begin. I think the correct place to begin is with Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal. Most people that study Kabbalah are familiar with the Luria, the Lurianic tradition of Kabbalah, which is basically he really brought to the world the forefront that study of Kabbalah is accessible to all. And it was only a few hundred years later with the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem, the founder of the Hasidic movement, who really took this to the masses and really, if we could use the modern lexicon, branded Kabbalah and the mystical tradition of Judaism to the masses. And one of the fundamental principles of the Baal Shem Tov was actually embracing the physical world. Many people at that time thought to be holy was to be a parish, sit in a room by yourself all day, study Torah, barely eat in the snow. In the winter, they used to roll in the snow to torture their bodies. In the summer, they laid in ant piles so the bugs would actually bite them because they despised the physical. They despised their bodies. They despised physical pleasure. And the Baal Shem Tov said, this is ridiculous. In order for us to reach spirituality, in order for us to connect to God, we have to do it through the physical. And in fact, what's such a beautiful story, and I bring the story in the book, the Baal Shem Tov wants to know who, after he passes from this world and goes on to the world of eternity, goes on to Olam Haba, goes on to paradise, who is he going to live next to? He wants to know. So they tell him that a certain person in a little shtetl is the guy who's going to live next to him. So Baal Shem Tov wants to meet the guy. If I'm going to spend eternity with somebody, shouldn't I meet him in this world? So he gets the wagon driver to get the wagons ready, and they go on this journey to this little shtetl, this little village in the middle of nowhere. And he meets a guy that's massive. It's huge. You have to put a number to a few hundred pounds. And the Baal Shem Tov looks at him, and he seems like a simpleton. Seems like there's nothing about him. And Baal Shem Tov watches him for a day, 2 days, thinks maybe he prays, maybe secretly at night. Elijah the prophet comes to visit him, but nothing. He's just a simpleton. And he spends his entire day eating. That's what he does. Finally, the Baal Shem Tov goes over to him and wants to understand, why is it that I'm going to be next to this person for eternity? And he asks the guy, the person, what do you do all day? He says, well, I eat. He says, well, that much I can see, but what else do you do? What's special about you? He says, actually nothing. All I do is eat all day. And Baal Shem Tov said, why is it that you eat all day? If this is everything you do, why? He says, very simple. When I was a young boy, the pogroms came into town, and they took my father I was a child, and it was, this traumatic experience. They took my father and they burnt him at the stake. And my father was this weak, scrawny individual. And I said that if they ever take me to the stake, I'm going to make sure that I'm healthy, I'm strong, I'm big. And therefore, I spend my day eating because of this trauma I had as a child, to make sure that if I burn, I'm going to really burn. I'm not just going to be a little weak, scrawny individual. And if the Baal Shem Tov at that moment realizes that it's this person's whole being is eating, but the purpose of his eating wasn't just because he loved eating, but there was for him, of course, he was a simpleton, but it was a way to attain spirituality. And he did it at such a high level that he merited to have a place in the world to come right next to the founder of the Hasidic movement, who on some level changed definitely then, but throughout history, changed the way Judaism looks in the world. Changed the fabric of Judaism at some level. So we see that the Baal Shem Tov understood, and one of his fundamental teachings is to embrace the physical. By the way, I'm sorry I went off a little bit on a tangent. I am a rabbi.
That ties in very, very nicely, really, to the book. And let's delve into the book. Kabbalah of Food, stories, teachings, recipes. We've talked about one story. Beyond the initial inspiration from one of your students, why did you write the book as food-related Hasidic tales together with religious teachings. Now, how did you organize the book? Because you've got three parts here. You've got the Hasidic tales, you've got the recipes and the food, you've got discussion about Kabbalah. How did you organize this to make it into a whole?
So organizing, making the whole, I think the credit goes to the publisher. But I think that I have to say that as a child growing up in the Hasidic world, I come from a large Hasidic family. Stories is the way you warm the heart, definitely for children, but technically the way to warm the heart. And Hasidic tales play a fundamental role in that, and especially the folklore around many of the stories, certainly the Baal Shem Tov. And there's so much of these stories that are around food. And I've always been a foodie. I always loved food. I always liked eating food. And for me, more than just the memories of getting ready for Passover and my mother in the kitchen cooking the brisket, or around Hanukkah after we light the menorah frying the latkes, more than just that, for me it was a way to, if I could use a mechanism to cope. Because when I was a young child, I was a little mischievous and a little chutzpahdik, if you could say. I would frequently answer back to my teachers when I probably shouldn't have. And one of the ways, at least then, going back 35 years ago, one of the ways of dealing with kids today, were a lot smarter and a lot more educated than how to educate, have a proper education system. But they would send you out of class. They couldn't deal with you. All right, go into class. But if you were in the hallways, this was pre-video cameras, the principal roamed the halls, and you get caught by the principal. He bring you into the principal's office and he'll call your parents. That is never a good thing. You see, if you call your parents when you get home, my parents, of course, didn't believe in corporal punishment, but nevertheless, it wasn't a nice experience coming home when your parents are disappointed in you, to say the least. And I had to figure out a way how to cope. And I got friendly with the cook. And the cook used to let me come in, sneak in the back door of the kitchen. And I was out of class. I used to save myself from getting caught by the principal. And I used to help her in the kitchen. And I remember her making pizza for lunch and soups and different other beautiful dishes. I think one of the best memories when she used to make farfal. Farfal is egg barley, but you have to brown it. So how she browned it in these large GI pots. Because she was an older lady at that time, and she had a few, helpers. And I used to help out in the kitchen, and obviously in ways that was appropriate. It wasn't dangerous. They weren't giving me the knife or something like that, and helped me get through my elementary days, to say the least. And thank God that academically I was able to pass the grades, so it was a win-win situation, I guess.
I want to talk about the recipes in a minute, but did you include a recipe for farfal? Do you have that in there just out of respect to her?
I should have. I did not include a recipe for farfal. You should know that farfal is actually something that's very difficult to make properly, because it's almost like a cross between a pasta and on one hand, the makeup of the way it's made. On the other hand, it's almost like a kasha. The size of the grain. So it's actually very, very difficult to make. And many people, the way they make it, it's almost like glue, because the glutens or the starches come out in the wrong way. And unfortunately, it comes as gluey consistency. So it's very, very difficult to make.
Yeah, well, we've just
should have.
We've just come through Pesach, and I always remember the matzah farfal that we would use on Pesach. But let's talk about your intended audience, because again, could have done a cookbook with recipes. You broadened it. Who is the intended audience? And what about the unintended audiences, or those that you hope might stumble upon your collection of food-focused stories?
Of course, you asked a difficult question. The goal of the book, and I think the goal that I try every single day, is just to inspire somebody. And if one person is inspired, that when they sit down and they have a meal, they don't just look at it as physical sustenance, but the food is actual spiritual sustenance as well. And that they can look at eating as a way to connect to godliness and connect to spirituality, then that is the ultimate goal. Of course, a cookbook is easy, but what is unique about a cook? And God forbid, I'm not knocking all the cookbooks. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge of the chef and the experience. But a cookbook, there's tens of thousands of cookbooks, and many of them are great cookbooks. And on the other hand, there are many, many books of Hasidic tales or different books on Kabbalah, spirituality. But I felt that there was lacking something that combined the two. That, of course, one has to physically sustain themselves, and you want some recipes. On the other hand, we need to spiritually sustain ourselves, and those two can come together. And if you look at any single holiday we have, is somehow connected to food. And Judaism is filled with it. I know they make many jokes about the food and the grandma, but this is true for all of us. We think back in our memories. What is the points that stick out? Going to Bubby's house and having chicken soup. Yeah, this is the thread of who we are as a Jewish people. And we have to understand it's not just about physical pleasure, but through physical pleasure, how we can connect to God.
Well, it seems that like food in your stories, take on several symbolic meanings, and not just literal hunger and thirst, but also the need for spiritual sustenance, as you've said, like compassion and correct. Would you say, and in selecting the stories for the book, how did you research that? How did you do that? How did you decide on, here's my list, and these are the ones that are the most connected to or the most appropriate to the literal food part of the book?
Actually, I think the harder part than collecting the stories was knowing which stories not to include. Because for every one story of Hasidic tale or Kabbalistic story about food, there's probably another three. And therefore, searching for the story that shows great meaning, just I'm not going to say the story in detail, the story of Herschel, the goat lover, how he spent his days taking care of goats to have the finest milk, to then take this milk and take care of the downtrodden, take care of the sick. And he used this in a way to sustain others, and how when the Baal Shem Tov met him, he saw this aura of light around him. And he thought he was one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim, the hidden righteous people that the world sustains itself on, spiritually speaking. So, and yet he did it through simply making sure that he had the highest quality milk, and he brought that milk to people that were sick and ill and needed care. So to me, that story shows many details. First of all, it shows how a person can reach a level of holiness that even the Baal Shem Tov is fascinated with. On the other hand, it shows how compassionate one can be with food. And on top of that, that this is what he does all day. This is what he spends his time doing. And nevertheless, with, what I would think meaner, small daily activities of feeding your goats and taking care of a few goats, I would think that maybe the person is, what is he doing? So he's a waste. Especially in American way, he has to be big, he has to be accomplishing the whole world, he has to, run a massive company. And yet he reached the highest levels of spirituality through living a simple life and making sure that the quality of milk he had to take care of the downtrodden was the highest level.
Now, you alluded to it earlier. You noted that of all the faiths in the world, Judaism has probably produced the most rules about eating. And you do a terrific job of explaining their meanings. Let's talk about that. The different places in our religious teachings in the Bible that food play a prominent role. You mentioned, for example, earlier sacrifices, but then we have all of the issues relating to kashrut, all of the issues relating to, for example, the protection of fruit trees. Tell us a little bit more about that. We're not, oftentimes, we read that, but we're not conscious all the time of how it relates to our daily lives.
So if you look at every single part of the Torah, let's just focus on the 5 books of Moses. Every single part of the Bible, the Torah, you have food. From Abraham making a treaty with Abimelech to Abraham 3 days after his circumcision, inviting guests into his home, waiting at the crossroads for guests, from Isaac to Jacob. Every single story is somehow connected to it. Even Joseph, when he meets his brothers, the main meeting that takes place is around lunch, around the meal. Then you get later in talking about which animals are kosher, which fish is kosher, which birds are not kosher. Then once we identified it, how do we prepare it? Then so not only which items are kosher, which items are allowed to be cooked together, and how you can cook it together, and when you can eat it. There are so many laws. In fact, one of the major parts of the 4 sections of Code of Jewish Law is simply in dealing with the rules of kosher. And besides for the rules of kosher, from what I understand, Judaism is the only religion that has a concept of kosher and non-kosher utensils. The Torah talks about when they're entering the land of Israel, the end of Moses' life, they take over and koshering or purging the flavors that were absorbed in their utensils to make it kosher. So we find this fascinating thing that kashrut is a major role. And then you have the whole concept of sacrifices. Sacrifices you can eat, who brings it, when they bring it. I mean, is it from a sacrifice from flour? Is it wheat? Is it a sacrifice from barley? And all these details of kosher. What's very interesting is one of the ways of identifying a kosher animal, or both the ways, is the animal chewing its cud and split hooves. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe asks the question, if we are required that when we eat food to be on a higher level, and we're supposed to be holy when we eat, what is unique that of splitting the split hoof and the chewing its cud of an animal that makes that kosher? Why are these identifying signs that makes the animal kosher? And he explains that many times a person has a blockage between his animalistic side and his godly side. He's constantly a struggle between spiritual and physical, between physicality, materialism, and spiritual. And he has to make sure that divide is totally split. Just like an animal's hoof has to be totally split in order for it to be kosher. If it's even half split, like a camel, it is not kosher. So too, your spiritual and your physical have to be totally one, and they can't have a separation dividing them. And then he says the concept of chewing its cud, what is it? The animal cannot process the grass. So he chews it with one set of teeth, goes down into one stomach, he regurgitates it, chews it again and again until he's finally able to digest it. So too spiritually, many times we are faced with a certain spiritual challenge, and we think we accomplished it. We passed this level of challenge within our life. And yet the next day or a week later or a year later, you find yourself struggling with the same issue. The answer is that one has to go back and re-elevate this struggle, this challenge that a person is faced with. You have to regurgitate it. You have to chew, like the animal chews its cud. You have to do it again and again until you totally refine yourself in the process. Of course, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. We could analyze every aspect of kashrut, of why that's important, of what is unique. Besides for looking, why does it make an animal kosher? How does that relate to me, right? The concept, the word Torah actually comes from the terminology of hora'ah, instruction. So we have to look at the things in Torah, besides for following the legal aspect of kashrut. What is the instruction into my daily life? How does that make me a better person? How does that make me affect my surroundings in a way of making it a better place, a better world and a better place to live?
Were the recipes in the second part of the book, many of which offer delicious recipes using a few simple ingredients, which is always good because you have them in the house, in the kitchen. I see you're sitting in your kitchen. Was it a collaborative effort? You mentioned the cook in your yeshiva. Were these recipes that you collected over time? Are these some of your own? How did that work? What was the process of deciding I got to have X number of recipes to get into this book? I'm going to choose the following.
So I guess like everything else, it's a process. There are recipes that my grandmother made, and how can you not include your Bubby's potato kugel recipe? And on the other hand, there are recipes that I cook in our home for my kids, or we have a Kabbalah bagel breakfast every Sunday. In fact, I I know that it's not a food show, but I prepared this morning. I don't know, can you see it? I made some bagels, and I have the dough over here as well. If you want to see, there's two ways to make bagels. When I grew up in Brooklyn, on every corner there was the hot bagel stands. They barely exist today. You know, these little corner stores. I don't know. Are you from Brooklyn? No.
No. Far away from New Hampshire.
Oh, New Hampshire. In Brooklyn, when I grew up, practically every corner had a huge sign, hot bagels. You went inside and there was an old timer, making bagels. And so for me, a bagel was, a big part of growing up. And, taking the city bus to yeshiva, you would stop off at the bagel shop on your way there to get a nice bagel, hot bagel with cream cheese. So today, first of all, those stores don't exist. And certainly where I live, it's difficult to get a good bagel. So I make bagels on Sunday morning, and I get to make it with my kids, and we love making it together. So for me, besides for the aspect of the recipe itself, there's also a special family part to it as well, that I get Sunday morning with my kids. My twin daughters come into the kitchen and we make bagels together. That itself is a special thing as well. And actually in the book, not to get all foodie in you, I actually bring the Montreal bagel style recipe, not the New York style bagel recipe. Now this is one of the most famous arguments in the Talmud. Which bagel is better? Is the Montreal style bagel better? Or is the New York style bagel better? The truth is that they're both great. They're just a little bit different. Whereas the reason why I use the Montreal style bagel is because it's a quick rise. The water you use is warm water, and therefore it rises quickly, and therefore it's easier for someone to make. The New York style bagel, you use freezing cold water, and it's got to rise overnight. So if someone's making it, it becomes more a bit, as my mother would say, a big pachka. It's a little bit too complicated to do. Of course, there's other differences. The Montreal bagel, they put in an egg, so that it's a little bit chewier. So there's differences in the recipes, but generally speaking, it was a little bit easier than the New York style bagel, and the process is shorter.
Well, I think you've got a little demonstration for us, but I want to, before we do that, it's interesting to say about arguing between New York bagels and Montreal bagels. I remember in graduate school seeing my first debate over the latke and the hamantash. It's interesting how we take sometimes our intellectual differences and we translate it into food. But before we do the demonstration, you appeared on the Food Network's Chopped. That's a pretty important place to be. And of course, we don't have the overhead cameras and all of the other things that food shows have. But just tell us for a moment about that experience, because those audiences are really tremendous. People watch it. They like that kind of program. What was that like being on that program?
The truth is that when I was going into it, I told myself I need to focus on two things. Number one, making a good showing. If as a rabbi going on national television, a television show, a cooking show, you have to make sure that you represent the Jewish people in a good and dignified manner. That's the most important thing. The second thing is, this will probably be a once in a lifetime experience. Enjoy it. Have a good time, and make sure that you don't later say, "Oh, what I should have or could have done." And maybe I'm wrong, but I felt that on some level I accomplished both of those things. It was a tremendous opportunity. They were unbelievably accommodating to all my needs. Beforehand, they called me and they asked, "Is there anything you're not allowed to cook?" So I mentioned to them that from a basic halachic perspective, I can cook pork. I can cook shellfish. The Torah has no prohibition of cooking most of the non-kosher. I mean, you're not allowed to cook milk and meat together, but shellfish you're allowed to cook, and pork or crab or whatever else it is. I said, but as a rabbi on national television, that would not be the right thing for me to do. So if you put pork in front of me, I would abstain. I wouldn't cook it, even though from a legal perspective, I can make an argument that there's no prohibition. And they said, no, don't worry. We are going to make sure that every ingredient is a kosher ingredient that you're able to cook with. And that was tremendously accommodating. The second thing they did was all my utensils were brand new. If anybody watches the show, they'll see there's a little piece of blue tape on my set of dishes, because they wanted me to know that they were brand new, and therefore There was no non-kosher cooked in the utensils before. And this is something I didn't ask for. When I got there, they told me about it. So they were really, in Yiddish, they say the word the mensch. They were really everything. They were so accommodating, so nice about it. They didn't have to be. And then when you show up there 5:30 in the morning, and I didn't leave till 9 o'clock at night. They had a special room for me to daven, to pray, and I had to pray 3 times in the day. A special room to go on the side. They really went out of the way above and beyond what I expected. So on one hand, it was a tremendous experience. On the other hand, they really accommodated it, and it was. I'm still grateful for it.
Well, now we've reached what some might say is the best part of this conversation. Rabbi Hecht has volunteered to show us a recipe from his book, A Kabbalah of Food. So, Rabbi, take it away.
Okay, recipe. I just wanted to, as I showed you a little bit earlier, I made some bagels. Of course, I can't cook with you the bagel. It takes way too long to make. But the basic, it's interesting to talk about the Torah. One of the sacrifices were flour sacrifices made out of flour. And there's a discussion, how were they made? With 10 different ways they could have been made. One of the ways was very similar to a bagel, because what's unique to a bagel is after you shape it, you first throw it in boiling water. What that does is it locks in the outside seal. It seals in that when it doesn't expand any further. And then when you bake, you have that chewy inside. That's the beauty of a bagel, right? A crunchy outside and chewy inside. And one of the cakes or flour sacrifices brought in the temple, they boiled it, they baked it, and then they took it and actually fried it on a pan. So I always call that the bagel. There are other recipes, there are other things that were, more similar to matzah, which is just water and flour and being baked. But this was I should say oil and flour and being baked. And as I mentioned, this is the Montreal style recipe, which I have from the book. New York and Montreal style is pretty similar, except the amount of time needs to rise. Montreal typically has a egg in it, which makes it a little bit chewier. In Montreal bagels, today you can still get the wood-fired oven. Today in New York, they're all, I guess, commercial. So when I grew up, they used to have these massive blocks of dough. You walked in, there was an old guy, and he cuts a big strip, and then he'd roll it like this with his hand. He takes the bagel, he puts it on like this. He goes like this, and then he puts it on his tray, making a New York style bagel. And I actually like that way, but I found it with my kids, especially small, a little bit more complicated. I say, do it like they do a donut. I tell them just make a little hole and just, get a little bit of a round shape as well. And of course, either way is good. They probably taste the same exact way. But if any true New Yorker would see you doing this to the bagel, they would be very, very offended. And then, of course, the topping, actually, there's a baker, a certified master chef at the Culinary Institute. His name is Richard Coppage. And he's one of pre-COVID, COVID has changed everything. But I used to go to his class and talk about kosher. And he teaches experimental baking. But before he was at the CIA, he was actually the chef that invented everything bagel. He said, we used to do sesame seeds, and then we did poppy seeds, and they did all these toppings. And what happened was, he says, all on the table, it all got collected by the end. So he said, actually, we took that, we started putting them on top. And he said, then the New York Times eventually wrote about it. And then it became accepted all over the country that there's an everything bagel. So it's interesting how that evolved and came about. I'm sorry I don't get to cook with you. I'm limited, as you said, in cameras and space. But that's basically it. Of course, there are many, many other recipes. And as I tell my kids, bagels are good once in a while. Today,
we have them once a week, and they actually are everything bagels. So, the book is A Kabbalah of Food: Stories, Teachings, Recipes by Rabbi Hanoch Hecht. It's available in store or online, wherever you purchase books. Rabbi Hecht, thank you so much for being here with me today and for bringing your passion for Jewish teaching and food to our audience. And of course, for the wonderful demonstration. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. A real honor and pleasure.
Well, our thanks to Rabbi Hanoch Hecht for sharing his unique perspective on food and spirituality and speaking with us about his book, The Kabbalah of Food. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.